I was never afraid of silence, until it started answering me. When my father died, I inherited no gold, no land, no fortune, only a house that seemed to remember everyone who had ever breathed within its walls. I am the eldest son of the Westmore family, but this inheritance felt less like an honor and more like a punishment. The road to it stretched through wet, mist-covered fields. My car rolled slowly along an old, forgotten highway that hadn't been repaired in decades. The asphalt cracked like ancient skin, and on both sides of the road stood oaks, dark, motionless, like sentinels. It felt as if even they remembered my name. When I first saw the silhouette of the house, the sky was already leaning toward dusk. Its large, black windows stared at me like the eyes of a tired creature. Westmore Hall, that was its name in the old documents, a place where every generation left a piece of itself. And it seemed no one ever truly left. I opened the heavy door, and the air inside was thick, almost tangible, like smoke caught between years. Every piece of furniture was covered with a thin layer of dust, but there were no cobwebs, as if someone had just cleaned. On the walls hung dozens of clocks. Different, old, but all stopped, each frozen at a different time. I walked down a long corridor, and my footsteps echoed across the floors. For a moment, it seemed that this echo was not just a reflection, it was an answer, as if the house was repeating my every move, reproducing my presence, memorizing it. In the drawing room stood my father's portrait. His eyes, painted in cold tones, looked disturbingly alive. I never liked that painting, even as a child. There was something too real in it. And now, alone in the quiet, I could have sworn he smiled. On the writing desk lay an envelope, old, yellowed, bearing my name. The seal was broken, but the ink on the signature was still fresh. I didn't open it. Not yet. It felt as though the house wanted me to wait. I went upstairs. The staircase creaked, not under my weight, but under memory, as if the wood remembered every step of the Westmores before me. On the second floor stretched a long hallway of doors. All were closed, except one. Inside was a bedroom with a large mirror. It stood opposite the window, and when I looked into it, I thought I saw something move behind me, a shadow. But when I turned, nothing. Only darkness and silence. I lay down on the old bed without undressing. I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from the feeling of being watched. Not by someone, but by something. Something without a face. From inside the walls came faint crackling sounds. Maybe the wood, maybe the house itself. Breathing. Toward dawn, I finally drifted into uneasy sleep. And when I woke, the mirror stood on the opposite side of the room. I woke up with a strange feeling, as if the air had grown heavier, denser. It seemed that the night hadn't yet ended, though dim daylight was already seeping through the curtains. I sat there for a few minutes trying to gather my thoughts, but something immediately unsettled me. The mirror. The same mirror that had stood opposite the window last night was now beside the door. I remembered exactly how it had stood before, angled to catch the first rays of dawn. And now, a different angle, a different reflection. I stepped closer. In the glass, I looked pale, blurred, as if someone had painted me on fog. In the corners of the mirror, something stirred, like dust. But when I leaned in, the dust shifted into faint shapes, almost silhouettes. I blinked, and they vanished. It didn't feel supernatural. It felt trivial, a trick of the eye, fatigue, nerves, the weight of a sleepless night. I tried to explain every detail logically, even when I noticed that the carpet in the hallway was no longer red, but brown. Even when the clock in the hall, which had been silent yesterday, now ticked steadily, showing 3:17, the same time my grandfather once mentioned in his journal. That's when the house remembers. I recalled those notes, the ones I'd found last night in the library. An old notebook with slanted handwriting, ink almost gone, but one passage burned itself into memory. The house has its own rhythm. It breathes when we sleep. It changes itself so we forget where the beginning ends and the end begins. I hadn't believed it then. But that morning, I started to feel that it wasn't a metaphor. When I went downstairs, the living room was different. The same furniture, but not where it had been. The table was closer to the window, the candelabra turned at a new angle. Even my father's portrait had changed. Not much, but enough to notice. The eyes no longer looked directly at me. They gazed slightly to the side, at a bare hook on the wall, as if another painting once hung there. I ran my fingers along the frame, no dust, and no mark on the wall. Only the strange sense that someone had just taken the picture down. I stopped and breathed in. The air smelled of wax and old wood. But there was another note now. Faint, elusive, like smoke after a candle is snuffed out. I checked the candle holders. None were lit. When I looked up again, the clock had stopped, its hands frozen at 3:17. I tried to wind it, but the mechanism wouldn't move. And when I leaned closer, I heard, very faintly deep within the walls, ticking, but not from this clock, from others. Dozens. The sound came from everywhere at once, as if the house itself were made of clocks, each keeping its own separate time. I went to the library to distract myself, but even there things were different. The desk stood closer to the fireplace, and on it lay an open book I hadn't seen before, an old edition, coverless. The text was hard to read, but I recognized the handwriting, the same as in my grandfather's journal. The page was dated March 1879. A single line was underlined in thick ink. Do not trust the stairs after the second night. They no longer lead where they used to. I lifted my head. The library was still, but when I stepped into the hallway, the staircase looked different. One step longer. I had known this house for only a day, yet I was sure there had been 11 steps yesterday. Now there were 12. I set my foot on the first step, and the house sighed. When I reached the bedroom, the light had changed. It didn't come from the window anymore, but from the walls themselves. I tried to open the window, and it wouldn't budge. The glass was cold, and beyond it I heard a sound. Not wind, not rain, but a low, steady hum. Like a pulse. I turned back toward the bed. My journal lay there. My own. But I didn't remember leaving it. I opened it, and saw new writing. The date matched that very day. The first line read, "Today, the furniture changed again. I think the house is studying me." I hadn't written that, but the handwriting was mine. I sat for a long time staring at the words. Then I closed the notebook, set it on the desk, and stepped into the hall. The door behind me closed on its own. That was the first moment I felt real fear. Not because the house moved, but because it knew when I began to understand. I tried to find an exit, but the house seemed to have none. Every door led either to the stairs or to empty rooms that faded into fog. The windows were black, mirror-like surfaces where I saw my reflection moving. A moment too late. It turned its head after me, not with me. I stood in the hallway, barely breathing. Somewhere below in the hall, one clock ticked, then another, then all at once. And in that perfect unison of sound, I heard slow footsteps on the floor beneath me. I didn't go to look. I just stood there, listening. The steps were even, familiar. If I hadn't known I was standing still, I'd have sworn. It was me. I stopped counting the nights. In this house, time lost its meaning. Days seemed to repeat themselves, almost identical, but with small distortions you only noticed when it was already too late. I lived among echoes, the echoes of my own footsteps, my thoughts, my breathing. Even silence had shape here. It wrapped around everything, thick, heavy, and sticky. And if you listened closely, you could hear something whispering within it. I realized then, this house wasn't just old. It was alive, and every wall was an artery through which memory flowed. One morning I woke to a strange sound. Not footsteps, not the ticking of a clock, something else. A whisper, as if someone were murmuring in the next room. I stepped closer to the wall. The voices stopped, but when I placed my palm on the cold plaster, I heard my name. Quiet, but clear. Daniel. I jerked back. On my hand, a faint mark of dust, in the shape of another hand, larger than mine. I went downstairs hoping to find a rational explanation, but every step I took echoed through the house, delayed, doubled, as though someone followed half a second behind. In the main hall stood the same clocks as before, but now they all ticked together. Hundreds of mechanisms, one after another, steady, cold, all showing the same time. 3:17. I sat in a chair near the fireplace. From the ashes rose a faint thread of smoke, though I hadn't lit a fire in days. And there, in the dim light, a silhouette, barely visible, like an imprint in the air. A human figure standing opposite me. I blinked, and it vanished. But the smell of smoke lingered. That was when I understood. The house wasn't showing me ghosts. It was showing me the past. The rooms didn't change without reason. They were repeating what had already happened. Every night was an echo of someone's story that had ended here. In the library, I found another notebook, older than the rest. Its cover had crumbled, but on the first page there were a few lines, still legible. The house does not forget. Once you enter, it keeps you. Then I started noticing things I couldn't explain. On the writing desk, my pen, still wet with ink. On the windowsill, a teacup, steam rising from it. I didn't remember making it. And on the wall of the study, a portrait. Not of my father, not of my grandfather, of me. I stood by the window wearing the same suit I had on now. Below, a date, 1923. I touched the signature. The paint was still wet. Breathing became difficult. I went upstairs to the bedroom. That's when I first noticed. The mirror no longer showed the present moment. When I approached it, my reflection was already standing closer to the bed than I was in reality. It was as if the mirror was a few seconds ahead of me. I froze. In the glass I kept moving, though I was perfectly still. My reflection's hand reached forward, slow but deliberate. I stepped back, and everything snapped back to normal. I realized the house had started to confuse us. It wasn't me reflecting the house. It was the house reflecting me. Later that day, I heard a noise from the west wing, the part where the doors had always been locked. Now they stood slightly open. Inside, a windowless room, only an old armchair, and dozens of clocks scattered on the floor, dismantled, faceless. They didn't tick, yet I could hear them inside my head. I bent down to pick one up. On the back cover, a single word was carved. Remember. I left the room, but couldn't find my way back. The hallway stretched longer. The stairs changed their angle. Doors led to the same rooms again and again. I walked for what felt like hours before realizing I was moving in circles. Each time I passed the mirror, the reflection changed. First, I saw only myself. Then, myself, but older. And finally, an empty room. I stopped before the mirror one last time. The glass was scratched, thin lines like marks from fingernails. And between them, faintly etched words, I am still here. I stepped back. The chill that swept through me was physical, like the house had exhaled. Then I finally understood the meaning of the silence between clocks. It isn't emptiness. It's memory. A moment where everything that was collapses into a single drop of time. And when it falls, someone disappears. That night I heard the ticking again. But it wasn't coming from the walls. Not from the clocks. It was coming from inside me. I was no longer afraid of the house. Fear had faded as quietly as daylight, leaving not even a shadow behind. In its place came another feeling, a calm, almost solemn unease, the kind that precedes something inevitable. I knew I couldn't leave until I understood what the house was keeping. Not merely echoes of the past, not just fragments of time. Something greater. It was as if the house itself wanted me to descend to where its heart was. The cellar lay behind heavy doors beneath the staircase. I had seen them on my first day, but then they had been locked. Now, they stood open. From the darkness rose the smell of damp earth and old wax. I took a lantern from the wall and went down. The staircase descended far deeper than it should have, farther than the ground could allow. My footsteps sounded dull, each one echoing 3 times, as though the house repeated them after me with a slight delay. The air thickened, heavier, laced with the faint scent of ash. And then below I heard it. Not the ticking of a clock, but a low, steady thump. A heartbeat. The cellar wasn't a storage room, it was a hall. Tall walls lined with dark stone. On each one, rows of names carved into the surface. Old names written in different hands, some nearly worn away. I stepped closer. My fingers traced the cold letters. Henry Westmore, 1781. Eleanor Westmore, 1824. Charles Westmore, 1860. And so on, further and further down the wall. The last line was blank. Fresh scratches cut across the stone, as if it were waiting for someone to inscribe another name. I stood staring at those names, and it came to me. Each time the clocks had stopped, someone from this wall had ceased to exist. But they hadn't left. They had stayed. Not as ghosts, not as memories, but as part of the house itself, rewritten into its very walls. The stone beneath my hand began to grow warm. I stepped back and saw the names faintly glowing like embers. In the dark, they pulsed softly, alive. Then I heard the voices, quiet, muffled, but not hostile. They didn't call or frighten. They remembered. Among them, my father's voice was clearest. He didn't speak words, but I understood him. We don't die, son. We simply become part of what we loved. A strange calm washed over me. This house wasn't a prison. It was an archive, a keeper of memory. It didn't hold us from malice, but from devotion. It loved through preservation. It kept those who belonged to it, not out of cruelty, but from the need to remember. I understood now. This had been happening for centuries. Every Westmore who returned left an echo behind. And now, it was my turn. I walked to the center of the hall. On the floor stood an old clock, its glass gone, its hands scorched, but its mechanism still ticking, quietly and even. I leaned over to stop it. And when my fingers touched the metal, warmth spread upward, not from the clock, but from the stone beneath it. Flashes filled my mind. Rooms I had seen before but changed. The living room full of people, laughter, glasses clinking, an old celebration. Then, fire, smoke, screams, and then silence again. I saw generations of Westmores one after another, all of them leaving the house and all of them returning. Each who entered for the last time felt exactly what I felt now. When the vision faded, I stood alone in the center of the hall. On the far wall, The blank stone was no longer empty. A new inscription shimmered faintly in gold. Daniel Westmore, 2022. The house exhaled, softly, gratefully. Warmth spread around me, not the warmth of fire, but of peace. I climbed the stairs. The living room greeted me with the gentle glow of a single lamp. All the clocks were ticking again, for the first time in perfect unison. My father's portrait faced me once more, but now his gaze seemed kind. I sat in his chair, feeling the house slowly grow still. I realized I would not die here. I would simply remain. In the walls, in the wood, in the silence between clocks. The house would remember me, as it had remembered all before me. And one day, when another descendant crosses its threshold, I'll be watching, from the portrait, waiting for the moment they hear the first tick. Silence filled the room once more. Only one sound remained, the steady, soft heartbeat of the house. And within it, another. Mine, beating in the same rhythm. This journal was found 7 weeks after the Westmore Estate was reopened. Locals said the front door had been left ajar, though the key was still in the lock, from the inside. No one dared to enter until the city officials arrived to determine who the property belonged to. On the desk in the library lay a diary. The pages were faded with age, but the ink looked fresh. The final entry began simply, "I know now the house is not cruel. It remembers, and that is why it lives. I can feel its breathing growing calm. The clocks no longer tick out of sync. They move together, like a heart that has learned to beat again in unison. I no longer search for an exit, because I understand. The house is not a place. It is us. Everyone who ever lived here loved, feared, dreamed. We became part of its structure, like pages of the same book. Now I understand why the walls sometimes speak. It is not the whisper of the past. It is memory. The house doesn't want to be forgotten. It keeps us, so that none of us ever truly fade." This morning I heard the old clock in the hall begin to work again. It stopped 42 years ago when Father died. Now its hands move once more. It means he has forgiven and accepted me. I am no longer afraid of the dark. Within it are our voices, and when someone new arrives, the house will greet them just as it greeted me, with memories that still breathe. I will not disappear. I will remain here, in the silence, between the beating of clocks. And if someone hears a soft ticking in the night, let them know. It is me. The house remembers. After that, a blank page. No ink, only the faint imprint of handwriting pressed into the paper, as if someone had written without a pen. The house itself appeared calm. No signs of decay, no dust. In the parlor hung a portrait of a man in his 40s, dressed in a dark coat, his face gentle and composed. Below it, the inscription read, "Daniel Westmore, the last heir." When investigators examined the clocks, every single one showed the same time, 3:17. None were behind. None had stopped. And as they left the estate, one of the men nodded toward the door and quietly said, "Strange, but it feels like the house is breathing." That evening, as they drove away from the grounds, someone glanced back and noticed a faint light glowing in a window on the second floor. Soft, warm, as though someone had left a lamp beside the bed to read one last page before sleep. And when the wind passed through the old oaks lining the road, they all heard it. A quiet, almost imperceptible ticking. Not eerie, peaceful, steady. The sound of a house that remembers. Many years had passed. The Westmore Estate stood abandoned, overgrown with grass, forgotten even in the city's records. Until one day, it was purchased by a new owner, a collector of old buildings, a seeker of stories that hadn't survived their own time. He moved in for a few weeks to examine the house. What fascinated him most was the library, a large, dim room that smelled of wax and aged paper, On the desk, beneath a thin layer of dust, lay a journal. Leather-bound, edges charred, the ink faded, but the letters were still legible. He began to read. The first entries described ordinary things: the arrival, the night, the house that breathes. Then came tangled thoughts, strange mentions of shadows in mirrors and clocks that tick inside. The handwriting grew shakier, as though the author had written in darkness. On the last page, there was only one line. Uneven, but clear. The ink still fresh. I am the eldest son of the Westmore family, and I am still here. When the man lifted his eyes, he saw his reflection in the mirror across the room. But it wasn't simply looking back at him. The eyes in the reflection moved after. That evening he left the library door open, and when the wind outside finally died down, someone unseen turned the page.